Hi friends, it's Jen again, and we are back for video 3 of the video series about my unplugged quilt pattern. In this video, we're going to talk all about constructing your quilt top. So just a quick reminder, you don't have to watch the videos to make the quilt, but if you want to make the quilt, you do need to get a copy of the pattern, which you can get at my website, jengeorgeburt.com. Okay, so I have made this quilt several times, and every single time I am surprised. I'm happily surprised by how quickly the top comes together. I also like that it's not fussy. There's not a bunch of seams that you have to match up. And I've also built some wiggle room into the pattern at some really critical points in the construction process. So that just makes it, quick, fun, stress-free. It's just fun to make a quilt top that you don't have to stress out about, right? Okay, so in the last video, we talked about cutting up all of our fabric, and now we're going to sew all that fabric back together again. So let's don't waste any more time. Let's just jump over to the sewing room and get started. Hi folks, we're here in the land of make and do, which if you don't know, that's what I call my sewing room. So we're going to start working on piecing the quilt top for Unplugged, and the very first thing that we need to do is to make the plug head blocks. And for reference, that's what this is. So there's 6 of them. There's one for each column. So I have laid out over here the pieces that are needed to create it. So this top part here is called the prong unit in the pattern. This one has the inventive name of the middle unit, and this one is the base unit. So let's talk about each of those in turn. So the prong unit, this one's super simple. You just sew all of those together, and then you sew that onto the bottom. So nothing hard about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'll go ahead and say here that I don't care which way you press your seams. It works either way. I am a press to the dark side kind of girl, but I will mix things up. I'll give you a warning here. If you always press to the dark side, right here in these corners, you will get a lot of bulk. So you might want to press, if you're pressing to one side or using a mix, press to the dark here and then maybe press this seam open. So I'll leave that up to you. I'm not here to boss you around. All right, then the base unit. This one is easy too. You just sew these onto that, sew these onto that, and then sew the 2 things together. Again, press to the dark side, press them open. It doesn't matter. You won't get a lot of bulk in this no matter what you do. All right, now the middle unit. I'm just going to pull the pieces off of the tray here. Okay, so you can see in the picture that what we're going for is this section here. And there's angles, right? And you're saying, Jen, that's not going to make what you're hoping it's going to make, right? Okay, so we're going to fix that. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut these angles in. So I need my ruler, and I am going to use, I have a variety of marking utensils here, depending on what I'm going to mark. There's just random things depending on the color of the fabric. This is a friction pin, which is what I would usually use and what I'll use on the white. It won't show up on the black. This pin is just when you iron it, it goes away. Honestly, it does not matter what you use as long as you can see the mark, because we're just going to be making tiny marks that are going to end up in the seam allowance. So no one's going to see them anyway. All right, let's start over here with this one, and we want to make an angle that goes this way. So this piece is 3 inches across the top. So I'm going to use my friction pin, and I'm going to mark the middle, which is at 1.5. See, I just made a tiny, tiny little mark there. All I need to do, I need just to be able to see it, okay? So then I am going to take my ruler, and I am going to line it up so that it goes exactly through that point that I marked and this bottom right-hand corner. And then I'm just going to cut that. So that's the first piece. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing on this side, but we need the angle to go that way. So we do it again. We mark the middle. And then we line up our ruler so that it goes through that point and through the bottom left corner in this case. Super. Now we need to cut these same angles here. So to do that, I'm going to switch over to my white pin, and I'm going to measure in, again, 1.5 inches in from this side, and then 1.5 inches in on this side. So that's all I've done. I've just measured 1.5 inches in. And now I'm going to use the same trick. I'm going to put my ruler through this top corner and through this thing that I marked. And I'm going to cut that off. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And there we go. We've got all of our angles cut with no drama. So the next thing that we have to do is to sew these together. Now, if you've ever sewn 2 angled pieces together, you know that you usually have to worry about dog ears. So I'm sewing this on, so I flip it over. These happen to be exactly the same length. So, but normally you think, oh, I need to scooch it this way or need to scooch it that way. It turns out that this angle is so weird, it's hard to tell what angle you should cut. So my suggestion is don't worry about it, all right? So just line them up and just sew right here. Same thing on this side, flip it over, line it up, and then sew. So you're going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowances right along here. Now, you're going to probably freak out, perfectionist, and you are going to hate what's going to happen next, but just bear with me. We have wiggle room built in that will fix this problem. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine and sew these pieces, and then I'll come right back and we will go on to the next step. Okay, I'm back. Now, moment of truth. Let's press this open and see what happens. Now notice this one is a little too high on this side and a little too low on that side. And this one is the same. Sometimes it'll be one or the other depending on a variety of factors. So I would take this over to my ironing board and press it, which is what I'm going to do right now. But when I made this quilt the first time, I unsewed this multiple times and tried to keep finagling it. And then I realized, you know what? It doesn't matter. If this thing is 1/8 of an inch shorter than the plug head, the middle of the plug head that's 2.5 feet away from it in the quilt, no one's going to notice. So I've built in wiggle room into another point in the quilt making process. So if this isn't exactly the right size, it's not the end of the world. All right, so I'm going to go press that real quick. All right, I've pressed this, and I just realized I pressed it to the light fabric, but let's not stress out about it. So as you can see, this is not exactly straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to line up this line with a line on my mat like this. And then I see, okay, that's a little short. So let's scooch it over just a little until I can see that when I cut on this line, when I cut on that line, it's just going to sliver off the problem. We make the problem go away. And then we'll do exact same thing on this side. I like to, sort of make sure it's sort of square. I can see if I cut right along here, that will do the trick. And now I have a middle unit that looks like I knew what I was doing, right? Okay, so this thing is going to be the same width as these once you've sewn them all together. And then you're going to sew the prong unit, which is this part, all of that, to the middle unit, to the base unit. So I'm going to go do that right now, and then we're going to come back and we're going to add these sides on here. All right, so I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back and I have made the middle portion of the plug head block. Now the next thing that I need to do is to add these skinny strips onto the outside, a little bit of extra background fabric. So those pieces are these. They're the bees from your pattern. And you're thinking, Jen, you had us cut these way too long. And you're right. I did it on purpose because when you're cutting the fabric, it was just easier to tell you to go ahead and cut these at 32 inches and then cut them down later instead of having you cut them then. So what we're going to do is just going to line this up like this. I'm going to let these be 1/2 inch to 1 inch longer and these 1/2 inch to 1 inch longer. And then I'm just going to whack them off. I don't have to worry too much. All right, so that's just extra scrap. I cut them a little longer because if you've ever cut sewn long skinny strips, you know it can get kind of weird at the beginning. And we want to make sure when we fold these out, we have a nice straight line and we don't have some thing going too far up. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. I'm going to line that up just like that. And I'm going to sew along each of these sides. And I'll be right back. And I'm back. So I've added these strips onto the outside and I have pressed the seam allowances. All right, so I'm about to tell you another little secret of where I've built in some wiggle room for you. So not only were these strips cut too long, they were also cut too wide. And I did that on purpose because when I was testing this out, I just kept finding that if I actually cut these at 1.5 inches, which is what they really should be, it was too easy for it to get squirrely on the edge. All right. So also, if you had any issues with your 1/4 inch seam allowance in here anywhere, you might end up with a block that's not the right width. So it is imperative that this block turns out to be 13.5 inches wide because that's how wide each of the columns in the quilt is. And everything in the column is based on this block. So if this block is the wrong width, your columns are going to get all weird. So how do we get this to be the right width? All right, so it's supposed to be 13.5 inches wide. So let's go over here and look and see what it actually is. It is more like 14.5 inches. So it's almost a full inch too big. So, but we can't just cut an inch off one side, right? Because if we do that, this is not going to be in the center. So what we're going to do, and this is in the pattern, I'm going to use my friction pin for the top. This is the middle of the block up here, and that is 3 inches wide. So I'm going to mark right there at that. And then I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom. I have to switch to a white pin in this case. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I want to measure right here. Okay, so now I know exactly where the middle of the plug is. So in the pattern, I tell you this number. So 13.5, half of that is 6 3/4, which I know is a really weird number, but that's what it is. So I line up with 6 3/4 here at the bottom and with 6 3/4 here at the top. And now I know that this thing is exactly in the middle. So I am going to line up my ruler with, and I have to peek over here because mine is a little bit too long. I'm going to make sure that's lined up, and it is. So I cut right here on the 0 line and take that off. And then I come over here to 13.5, which is, let's get it here. Let's make sure this doesn't get weird. Take your time doing this part. No need to get into a rush. This part is one of the only times where you actually have to be kind of meticulous so you don't mess anything up. All right, we're going to make sure we're good. This is still a 6 3/4, 6 3/4. We're good. And slice that little sliver off there. All right, now our block is exactly 13.5 inches wide, which is what we want. Now we just need to cut off the little doohickeys, right? So that part's easy. We're going to line up one of the straight edges along the side here. And I'm going to slide this so I know when I cut right there, everything's going to be even with that. So line that up and I cut. Get rid of my fuzzies. And I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Right, that looks good. Well, that doesn't look perfect, so let's slide that way a little bit. All right. And there we go. In reality, this is supposed to be 22.5 inches this way. Let's check and see how well I did. All right. 22.25. So right now, you might say, oh no, it's terrible. No, it's fine. I have wiggle room built in later. It probably happened when we cut that little bit off the top and the bottom here. There's wiggle room built in, so we're going to make up for that later. So don't worry about it. The only dimension that matters for this block is that this is exactly 13.5. Whatever it is this way, we can compensate for that. All right, so that's it. We have made a single plug head block. You're going to make 5 more of those, obviously. And then I'm going to reset my table, and then we're going to come back and work on the cord blocks. All right, I've got everything reset. We've made the plug head blocks, and now we're going to come back and we're going to work on the cord block, which basically this is the cord of the plug and this is background fabric. So we're going to start out making our cords. Okay, so depending on how you cut your fabric, you are going to have either 3 long skinny strips of eye, or you're going to have 16 long skinny strips of eye. So it depends on if you've cut all your plugs and cords from the same fabric or from a bunch of different fabrics. So just follow the instructions in the pattern about how you do that. I'm going to show you what happens if you cut them one plug at a time. So if you've got 3, you're just going to sew them together end to end like this. That's all there is to it, just a straight seam. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and do that really quick, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back and I have sewn my 3 long strips together. So this is the cord for a single column. All right, so in the pattern, you're going to notice that each of the cords is a slightly different length. That is what makes the pattern look great at the end, but it also adds a little bit of extra, spiciness to the piecing process. So we have to pay attention to how long we're going to cut all of these, or otherwise we're going to be in a bit of a mess. All right. So there is a table in the pattern that tells you exactly how long the cords need to be cut for each column. So pay attention to that. Double check your numbers before you cut it, and you'll be fine. So this first one, let's assume that this is for column 1. And so that one needs to be exactly 39.5 inches long. So my mat is only 36. So the way I get around this is, now you could, if you got measuring tape or something like that, you could do that, but this is how I do it. So I go over here, I line this up all along a line, and then I'm going to use one of my marking pins. Let's get the right one. And I'm just going to mark right here at 36 and 36. Just tiny little marks, just like always. Now, let's see, 36, that's 3.5 more inches than I need, right? To get to 39. So I'm going to line this up with 3.5, and then I'm going to mark again. All right, so that's it. I know that if I cut right here, which I will line up those on that, and I cut right there, that it's going to be 39.5 inches long. And there I have it. So if you're cutting this from one long continuous strip, like you have to do if you've cut all the cords and plugs, it's the exact same process. You would have just cut right here, and then you would just keep cutting the rest of your cords the proper length. So that's it. There's nothing more complicated than that. So the next thing that we have to do is we've now got the cord, and we want to add these background pieces onto the side. And those come from the A pieces, which I've got right here. And there's 3 of them. And you're going to say, Jen, this isn't going to work, but it will, I promise. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave these 2 pieces whole. And then this last A, we're going to fold in half. I'm just going to press a little mark in there. And then I'm going to cut that. All right. So I can be pretty exact here and cut this exactly in half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this onto the bottom of this piece, and I'm going to add this onto the bottom of this piece so that I get pieces that are too long. Now, for some of the cords, they're longer, so this is going to be closer to the right length over here. But I just made you cut all of them exactly the same, and then we'll cut them down to size later. All right, I'm going to go to my sewing machine and sew these, and I'll be right back. Okay, I have sewn my background pieces so that they're longer than my cords. So now what I need to do is decide where I'm going to sew this cord on. So one thing to keep in mind, you don't want to sew this like this because you're going to get a bigger lump here. So there's a seam here and a seam here. That's going to be a lump. So just avoid that. But otherwise, there's no real rules about what you're going to do here. All right. If you want to, and if your fabric is not directional, you might want to turn this strip around the other way, and then you don't have to worry about if these line up. And honestly, you still don't have to worry about that. But some people are more perfectionist than I am, and you might want to keep that, visually your line might look weird. So you can decide exactly how you want to do that. And then once you figure out, okay, I'm going to sew them together like this, then go your end over here and just cut off some of the extra. So leave half an inch, just like we did in the other, when we sewed the sides onto the cord head blocks, and then you'll have that all done. So I'm going to go do that now, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now I've sewn my background pieces onto my cord, and the only thing I have left to do is to just trim up the edges. Now remember, we cut this to exactly 39.5 inches long, so we know that that's exactly how long it needs to be. So that saves you a little time because you didn't have to measure those pieces. So I'm going to get my ruler. I'm going to line up this with a line here, and then make sure I'm square along here. That looks great. And then I'm just going to cut right along this line to cut off the extra. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other end to get that one to the correct length. Line it up with a line. Get that straight. And cut. All right, so we now have one cord unit, and then we've already got our plug head unit, and we are ready to actually make a whole column of the quilt. So again, I'm going to reset everything, and then we're going to come back and do the next part. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is to make one column of the quilt. We've already made the cord unit, we have our plug head block, and then we have this extra piece of background fabric, which is called piece C in the pattern. So those are the 3 pieces that we have, and we just need to sew those together. When you're sewing this on, make sure you sew it to the prong side or else obviously your plug's going to look a little weird, right? It's going to be truly unplugged if you sew them in the wrong direction. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew those 2 seams, and then I'm going to come back and we'll have this whole thing. All right, so I've now sewn my entire column together. I've got my cord, the plug head, and all of this extra background fabric at the top. Now I had you cut the same amount of background fabric for every single plug, but obviously we're going to need to cut some of this off, some of it more than others. If you have a really short cord, you're going to be preserving more of this, but if you have a long cord, you'll only have part of this. So how do we decide how much to cut off? Well, each cord needs to be, so if we look at the diagram of the final quilt, you can see that each of them, they need to be the same length, right? So it happens to be that they need to be 72.5 inches long. So we've made this one, and we need to cut off some extra up here so that it is exactly 72.5 inches long. So let's do that. So you're going to start measuring from the plug end, because we don't want to cut any of that off. We want to cut over there. So I'm going to line that up with 0 on this side, or 36 as it happens to be, but that starter thing. And then I'm going to come across here, and I'm going to use that same trick that I did before when we were measuring the long pieces of cord, and I am going to use my friction pin, and I'm going to make sure this is nice and smooth so that I know I've measured correctly, and I'm going to mark right here where 36 is. And 36 plus 36 is 72. So we're almost there. If we line this up with the 0 mark on the side, make sure that's lined up. And we're going to go with, just take your time here, because this is critical that this gets cut to the right length. Otherwise, you're going to have columns that aren't all the same, and you will be sad. So there we go. We're lined up there, we're lined up there. Okay, so now I'm going to mark again at 36, and then I would scooch it over. So that's 72, all right? I need 1/2 inch more. It just turns out that the way my mat is, that's exactly 1/2 inch. So I just mark right there. But if your mat's not the same, then you would scooch it over and just measure another 1/2 inch. That's all you have to do. So I always mark on both ends, because I found if you only mark on one, it's really easy to get off when you cut, right? So you don't want to do that. Let's get the ruler, and I am going to cut straight through those last marks that I made. And then on column 1, this is how much extra you are going to cut off. Like I said, on some of them, you're barely going to cut off any, and on others, you're going to cut off, quite a lot. So the important part is to get it to 72.5 inches. And once that's done, you're going to go ahead and make all your other columns. So you'll make all of those, and then you're going to assemble your quilt. So the way I suggest that you do it, because I've done it a couple of different ways, and this is the way I found is the best. I sew 1 to 2, and then I sew 3 onto that. So then I got half the quilt done. And be careful which way you flip these and which side you're sewing them onto, or you're going to be really sad that you have to unsew 72.5 inches, right? Okay, and then do the same thing. So 4 to 5, and then sew 6 onto that. And then sew that last seam to sew the 2 halves together. When you do it that way, you'll have, you'll be messing with less fabric at your sewing machine. So when you get all of that done, your quilt top is finished, and then you can move on to finishing it, quilting it, putting the backing on, all that. So I'm going to talk about that in the next video. So come back for the final video, and we'll talk about all the finishing related things.